man with the withered hand on a Sabbath, much to the consternation of the Pharisees. They were then going to meet to determine how they might destroy Jesus. The scripture of Matthew. When Jesus became aware of this, he departed. Many crowds followed him, and he cured all of them. And he ordered them not to make him known. This was to fill what had been spoken through the prophet Isaiah. Here is my servant, whom I have chosen, my beloved, with whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he will proclaim justice to the Gentiles. He will not wrangle or cry aloud, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. He will not break a bruised reed or quench a smoldering wick until he brings justice to victory. And in his name the Gentiles will hope. Word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
And from Isaiah chapter 42, the first 9 verses. Here is my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. He will not cry or lift up his voice or make it heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break, and a dimly burning wick he will not quench. He will faithfully bring forth justice. He will not grow faint or be crushed until he has established justice in the earth, and the coastlands wait for his teaching. Thus says God the Lord, who created the heavens and stretched them out, who spread out the earth and what comes from it, who gives breath to the people upon it and spirit to those who walk in it. I am the Lord. I have called you in righteousness. I have taken you by the hand and kept you. I have given you as a covenant to the people, a light to the nations, to open the eyes that are blind, to bring out the prisoners from the dungeon, from the prison those who sit in darkness. I am the Lord, that is my name. My glory I give to no other, nor my praise to idols. See, the former things have come to pass, and new things I now declare. Before they spring forth, I tell you of them. The Bible has something important to teach us about justice. So often in our culture and this time and this nation, when we speak of justice, we do it in terms of punishment. We want so-and-so brought to justice, we say, meaning we want law and order, whereby the person is captured, tried, and sent to jail or executed. Justice for us is about enforcing the law so the bad guys and gals pay for their crimes, preferably somewhere we don't have to see them or think about them again. But biblical justice goes way beyond judicial decisions. It refers instead to the order and well-being of a society as God intended, where everyone is cared for and their needs are met. The definition is so much broader than what we're accustomed to, in that biblical justice has to do with making things right, not just by penalizing the ones who have violated laws, but by repairing what is broken systemically. Where God's justice prevails, relationships among people and with the divine are based on love and the common good. Everyone has equal access to goods and services. When the welfare of one is threatened, all are threatened. Where God's justice prevails, poverty, illness, violence, and oppression cease because they cannot exist where love is. God's justice brings about God's peace, shalom. The Hebrew word for justice that is used here, mishpat, is featured prominently in the major prophets of Israel, who all identify justice as the primary sign of God's blessing on a nation. Throughout Israel's history, when the people stray from the covenant, the prophets use the word mishpat, justice, to call the people back, to remind them of their obligations to God and to one another, always both of those, God and one another, and to recall the story of God's intention for them. In the 6th century before the Common Era, some 500 years before the birth of Jesus, the Babylonians defeated Israel. They destroyed the temple, plundered Israel's treasure, took the Israelites into captivity, and exiled them from their land. The political, social, economic, and religious life of God's people, what they had known for years, was obliterated in that aggressive action. Absent from their personal reality was any semblance of God's justice. And I'm guessing that most of us can scarcely imagine what that must have been like for them, to lose everything, including their nation. Surely they must have thought God abandoned them. And for 50 years, the Israelites were banished from their homeland. And then, as the end of the exile drew near, the Persian Empire conquered the Babylonian Empire. And into that place of uncertainty and despair and helplessness, God speaks a word of hope, announcing the arrival of a servant who will make things right. The servant, the one called by God, will bring justice, will open blind eyes and liberate prisoners. What may have seemed equally as startling to the conquered Israelites is that, according to the prophet Isaiah, this change of fortune is an inevitability, but it's not going to happen through bullying or bad-mouthing, not through violence or coercion. In fact, God says of this servant, he will not cry or lift up his voice or make it heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break. A dimly burning wick he will not quench. He will faithfully bring forth justice. And that's the description of a peacemaker, right? Through the power of God's Spirit, this servant will establish justice and overcome evil quietly, gently, and peacefully. God's servant will be tender, taking care not to further wound those already injured, or to extinguish hope in those who are barely hanging on to what little they possess. God's servant will bring justice in ways that do no harm. I'm probably not the only one who can scarcely imagine this today, when the style of so many global rulers consists of high-volume bluster and swagger, whose leadership is marked by aggressive proclamations and menacing actions. The image of servant does not readily come to mind when we think of most leaders on the world stage today. The identity of the servant has long been in question. Many interpret the servant as Israel herself, who, just released from captivity and exile, will bear God's justice to the world. And there's some evidence for that. Just prior to this text, in Isaiah 41, God says, "But you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, the offspring of Abraham, my friend, you whom I took from the ends of the earth and called from its farthest corners, say to you, you are my servant. I have chosen you and will not cast you off. Christians, though, have tended to interpret the servant as Jesus, the one who will bring light to the darkness, justice to the nations. And especially at Advent, as we wait for the Christ child, we tend to read this and other texts as an obvious description of Emmanuel, God with us. But I wonder if both can't be true. These are holy scriptures here for both Jews and Christians. So for God to name Israel, who has known suffering and exile and restoration, as the servant to bring light and hope to others who suffer, seems right. But so too do we know Jesus as the suffering servant sent by God to redeem us. And what we know plainly from the scriptures and from Jesus' own words is that he was called to heal, to bind up the brokenhearted, to bring sight to the blind, to set the captives free. As one scholar writes, when the early Christians identified Jesus with Isaiah's servant, they implied, whether they knew it or not, that Jesus' primary goal in his earthly ministry was to bring justice to the nations and to root it deeply into the soil of the world. But here's the rub. If we claim both to be true, that God has a particular vision for how the people of God, both Jews and Christians, should bring about justice in the world, that means we're included. That job description in Isaiah isn't just for the ancient Jews, and it's not just for Jesus, the Savior. It's for us too. So is that a job description you want? Ruth will not cry or lift up her voice or make it heard in the street. Jean will not break a bruised reed. Frank will not quench a dimly burning wick. With humility and gentleness, Libby will bring justice to the world, and Joyce, and Pam, and Linda, and Margaret, and Jean. With compassion and empathy, Karen will bring justice to the world, and Bob and Lee, just graduated from college, has a job to do. And we'll do it, and you'll do it, free from violence and bullying and intimidation and threats. You'll serve as a light to the nations. Above your pay grade, maybe? Feels that way to me. Especially, I guess, since that's not the way our world works. To choose the role of peacemaker, justice restorer, and tiny little light in the huge darkness is to resist our culture and reject the ways that most people with power operate. It also means that we have to push against the prevailing culture and say no when those with authority and power act in our name in ways contrary to the justice that God has specifically told us to seek. So I'm a news junkie. You should know that by now. I talk about the news a lot when I preach. But the two most disturbing stories that I just have not been able to let go of this week, I expect you've heard of. I sit with them and I'm so unsettled. And it causes me to wonder how I, Ann Nobody Schwartz, can begin to address them. I don't know how to challenge them or change them. When a 7-year-old girl named Jacqueline Cal Macwin, a child from Guatemala, dies of dehydration and shock after being taken into custody at the border, when she and her father and 100 other migrants crossed illegally into the United States, following travel through a particularly isolated and rugged terrain. Stories are mixed as to whether or not she had had food or water in the days previously to her death. And it's really easy to judge and say that her father broke the law. But you know what? If my child were going to die, potentially in the place where she lived, I would take her someplace else to keep her safe. Not everybody would make that decision. So I wonder about parents who have to live with that, knowing that their choice, but the choices of others as well, allowed for their daughter's death. The trek is brutal, but current U.S. policy is making it more so. And then the other story also impacting children is the 4-year war in Yemen, which is being called the worst humanitarian crisis on the globe right now. The economy has collapsed. There are shortages of food and water and medicine and electricity. And while famine right now threatens 14 million people, aid groups estimate that 85,000 Yemeni children have already died of malnutrition. And one of the people who works for one of the aid groups said parents there are making Sophie's choice every single day, compelled by their circumstances to decide which of their children will live or die. The ethical dilemma of the awfulness in that place is that we, as a nation, support the fighting financially and with weapons and tactical support. So, how do we address that as Christians if we find that inconsistent with our call to be justice bearers and peacemakers in the world? And I imagine the helplessness of parents in other parts of the globe who literally cannot save their children from circumstances beyond their control. And I find that unbearable. And I wonder how I and how we as the church are to be servants in these situations. How do we make peace here in East Central Illinois to things happening on our border or on the other side of the world? We aren't going to fix it ourselves, I know that. But don't we have an obligation to do something? No offense, but we are the dimly burning wicks of which Isaiah speaks. Individually, we aren't going to set the world aflame. But you know, even the kids knew, one little flicker of light offers one little sliver of hope to somebody somewhere. We can do it with our prayers, with our activism, with our letter writing, with our phone calls, or with our support and care for somebody who's close to us when we can't reach somebody who's far from us. We are not the light of the world. That is not our job description, thank God. But we do each have a part to play in lighting the world. We have to find ways to offer people hope because there are so many people who are hopeless. We have to find ways to seek justice because there are so many people who do not know justice. And we have to find ways to make peace because there are so many people who don't know peace. It was written on our hearts at our baptisms, folks. It is the church's imperative. So protect the light you see. Be the light when and where you can. And shine like the world depends on it, because it